So just maybe very quickly just say a few more words about what I was saying yesterday about the idea of Buddhism being the meaning of life. And I think this is, these kind of ideas, which may seem kind of, if you're a Buddhist, may seem obvious in a sense. But these things are very important because a lot of the thing about being a teacher of the Buddhist ideas is that you want to present them in a way that people really grasp what the message is about, what this really is the purpose of all of this. And as I was saying yesterday, so often the Buddhist message is presented in a way that is kind of difficult to take into our lives and really understand and really appreciate properly. Too much focus maybe on asceticism and this side of things, and not really grasping that the Buddhist message is a very positive message. It's a message about improving our lives, about something very profound in human existence, and ultimately, and this is what is so fascinating, is that it actually is about the meaning of life itself. And most people forget about these things. We kind of give up on these things, from a young age. But the reality is that there is an answer to these very profound things. And if we get that, to me, it's like if we can get that message across, well, that's it. We've done our job. We've kind of sold Buddhism to the whole world, because then, of course, there is no choice. You have to, come on board and you have to practice these teachings because they concern the very kind of foundation of what it means to be a human being. So selling, kind of getting the message right is very important. And that's really when these things kind of really come together in a profound way. So today we're going to carry on in a similar kind of vein, I suppose. And the title for today's talk is, what is it again? It's... Is it? Is it? I don't think so. I think that was later on. Anyway, I think it's about something about his afternoon. Yeah, it was. I guess I think that's the one. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you. Take care of your being. Okay. So, and that kind of follows from the meaning of life, right? Because if you found the meaning of life, obviously an important part of that is taking care of your well-being. Yeah. And I want to start out by, talking a bit about how you don't take care of your well-being and how you rely too much on external things and not enough maybe on yourself. And this is something that happened to me fairly recently over the last few years. And this is like one of the, sometimes your personal experiences are often kind of the basis for so much of your Dhamma understanding, because that's when you grow, that's when things really start to come together. And a few years ago, I got this email, this message, and it was saying, would you like to contribute to this translation of the Tipitaka? And this is like a big translation project they're having in Thailand. And it's kind of a very prestigious translation project. And I was shocked when I got that email. I thought, me? What have I got to do with translation of the Tipitaka? There are all these scholars out there in the world. There's all these kind of big shots. I'm just this little monk down in Perth. What do I know about translation, etc.? And it was kind of, it's interesting when these things happen to you, things coming out of the blue, things that you don't really expect at all, that are kind of strange happenings. And then I, of course, initially I thought this probably was wrong. They had misunderstood. There was some other person they were trying to get, and they kind of sent the email to me by accident or something. But no, they actually wanted me to translate this Vinaya Pitaka, the whole kind of the discipline or the monastic side of, the regulations and the rules for monastics. And I found out later on, of course, how these things happen. And usually the way these things happen is the kind of word of mouth. Someone likes you for whatever reason and they think that you can contribute something. It's kind of really random sometimes how these things happen. And then you get, invited on this project. And so I realized actually it was serious. They wanted me to translate this Vinaya Pitaka. And I had already done most of the work anyway, so it was kind of easy. Yeah. And then as time went by, I started to meet with these people. There was a large group of scholars coming together to do the translation. And something like 70 scholars from around the world. And all of them had kind of PhD. They were experts in linguistics. They had studied Pali, Sanskrit, and Prakrit languages in ancient India and all of these kind of things. And I was the only one who had no formal background at all. I didn't know anything about linguistics. I have never studied Pali in a formal way. Didn't really know anything about Sanskrit. I was this self-taught, dodgy character in birth. What did I know about it? Ajahn Brahmali had taught me Pali to begin with, but the rest of it was basically self-taught. And initially, when you meet with a group like that, everyone is, many of them were professors at prestigious universities and these kind of things. Initially, you get this feeling of, what is that word again, when you feel like you're kind of in above your head with things. Imposter syndrome, imposter syndrome. I got this imposter syndrome feeling. It didn't last long, but I had it for a short while. What am I doing here? It's this kind of, I don't belong in this crowd. And so that was very fascinating when I had that feeling. But after a while, you realize actually many of these people, they're not exactly what you think they are. They don't necessarily have any greater understanding of these things than you have. Obviously they know more about linguistics. They understand more about the roots and the suffixes and the prefixes and the grammatical forms of kind of Indian languages. But there are many other sides to understanding these texts, such as practicing them on a regular basis. So that's being in an environment with other monastics who who elucidate these things through the lifestyle, through the way you are. There's many different aspects to these things where you can bring some different kind of knowledge to these things. And after a while, you feel quite relaxed with these people. Professor this, doctor that, and actually it's not such a big deal. And you feel like you're one of the boys or one of the girls or whatever. It's kind of like, both genders were quite evenly involved with these kind of projects. And so this is kind of the first thing. You start to realize that sometimes you think of other people in the wrong way. You put them on a pedestal that maybe they don't really deserve. And one of the people who was in this group of scholars, the one who was leading the whole project, he turns out to be one of the top monastics in all of Thailand, because this is a very prestigious project. So he was like the very top of the kind of Thai Sangha hierarchy. And then we had these meetings, and because I am a monk and he is a monk, obviously, then there were all these scholars there, and then he would often ask me for my opinion. And I thought, why don't you ask these scholars? Why don't you come back to me all the time? It's kind of really, really weird. And I reflected on this afterwards, and I thought, what was my reaction to this? There's two ways you can react to this. Either you can become arrogant and you think, I'm actually much better than I thought I was. I'm really cool. I know. That's one way of reacting. There's a kind of elevating, your ego kind of takes off completely because you think that actually, And that's one way, but actually, no, that wasn't really how I reacted at all. And what happened instead was more that I realized that I have put so many people in the world on a pedestal. You think that people know more than they actually do. You think that people are, because they are in some kind of high position, that they must be super intelligent or super wise or have some special quality that no one else has. But they haven't got that. They are pretty ordinary people. And that's a very interesting insight when you see that, because what it means to me is that you realize that that's not just the case for the people that you meet like this. It is probably true for pretty much everyone in the world, You have these presidents out there, you have these people in high positions, social positions, and when you meet them, they turn out to be human beings, just like each one of us. They're not really worthy of being put on a pedestal often in the way that we do. Sure, some of them have special knowledge, some of them have special insights, but at the end of the day, they are driven by many of the same things that we are driven by egos and desires and all of these kind of things. And they feel, when you deal with them, very much like human beings. And when you start to see that, we are all kind of similar in so many ways, and I start to think that, I imagine myself, what if I was in a position of great power? What if I was the kind of president of a country? That would be a really scary thought, if I was the president of a country. And then you realize that actually these presidents, they are also in a kind of similar position. Often they probably feel out of their depth. How can we resolve these problems in the world? Actually, they are probably irresolvable. There's nothing we can do about them. And so then you start to understand that the world is, to a large extent, out of control. Nobody knows what they're doing here. Well, they know a little bit. They don't know all that much. And when the world is out of control like that, when there's no one really in charge, there's no one we can really trust to know what is going on, it kind of becomes a bit repelling. It becomes a bit sort of, gee, do I really want it? How much do I want to invest in this world? How much do I want to be part in something which is so out of control and so unreliable? You don't know where it's going to go next. No one knows what they're doing here. This to me was a very interesting outcome of this process of being asked, of taking part in the translation project. The realization that people in the world are often much more ordinary than we think they are. And then when I reflected on this further, I realized that this is a problem in our life in general, that we often take authority figures often far too seriously. And it reminded me of when I was a small child. You've all been children here at one stage, I presume. So, and when you're a child, before you reach a certain age, your parents answer every question you have, and your parents are like God. They know everything in the whole world. And it's kind of this, you always go to mum and dad if you have a problem, or mum, how is this? And after a while they get a bit fed up. It's okay, later, this is not the right time to ask questions some other time, or whatever. And your parents are like the oracles, who can answer anything you want in the whole world. And then you come to a certain age, I don't know, maybe, 12 or 13, early teens or whatever, maybe a bit early, depends on the person, I suppose. And you start to realize that your parents don't know everything, That is like a shock to the system when that happens, And that is where rebellion begins, because at that point, you feel almost like you have been deceived in a sense. You thought the world was in one way, your parents had all the answers, and then when you realize that is not the case, actually, you feel like, you have been tricked somehow, and then you rebel against your parents, and you kind of go out hanging with your friends instead, and you try to find other sources of authority instead. And then we find some other source of authority, maybe a teacher, or maybe some kind of wise aunt or uncle or something like that, or maybe we go to have some kind of religion, we go to listen to whatever it is, and we find other sources of authorities. And then we realize they too have their limits. And then we go again beyond, but it's almost as if we never really fully let go of this idea that there are authorities out there that have some great insight into the world that we don't have. And the final authority usually with many people is the idea of God. Well, at least God knows. God created us. God is in charge of the universe. At least I can rely on God. And that is kind of for many people, the final barrier. But what if there is no God? What if this idea of a created God is kind of made up? What if we created God rather than God created us? And this is kind of for many people the final barrier. And when you think about it, and I think many people, especially Buddhists, the idea of a created God, it doesn't, to me, never made any sense. How can you believe in why would a God want to create this world anyway? If I were to create it, well, I wouldn't create it like this, that's for sure. So does that, that means that what does that mean? For this, it says something about this created God if you can't even create the world properly. So the whole idea of a created God to me makes no sense. It doesn't work. And I think it is, for many people, it is this kind of final thing that we need some authority. We need someone in charge in the world, someone we can trust, somewhere we can go, someone who has a kind of larger idea of the nature of what life is all about, so it doesn't all seem meaningless and pointless. And then you let go of that, because that too doesn't work. And something kind of magical happens when you let go of all of these kind of things, because you realize that actually you have to take charge of your own happiness. It really is about you. We are in charge of our own lives. And that is actually a wonderful thing. Because as long as you rely on God, as long as you rely on parents or rely on teachers or whatever, there's always going to be a degree of uncertainty there. Maybe they don't really understand. Maybe these things don't exist. Maybe you're putting your life into the hands of something which actually is not going to be able to deliver the goods at the end of the day. But to take charge yourself of your own life, it's empowering. Instead of thinking that something external is going to kind of look after you. No, you are in charge of your own existence. It's empowering. Now it is up to you to live your life well. And it can be scary because sometimes we feel, oh yeah, I don't really know, I don't really understand the world, yeah, I don't understand what to do, I'm deluded, I understand the limits of my own knowledge, all these kind of things. It can be scary to take charge of your own life. But you realize that at the end of the day, there is no other way. Yeah, this is the only way. That is where the empowerment comes from. This is where the ability to actually make a difference in the world arises from, that you take charge of your own existence and your own life. So we need to take charge of our lives in this way. It really is a kind of fundamental importance. And when we do that, actually, things start to become much better as a consequence. So it's a good thing to do this, and it's a positive thing to do that. And this is what I was talking about yesterday, and I was talking about the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, where the Buddha says you should be your own refuge, take the Dhamma as your refuge. Yeah, this is what it really means, is that you now become responsible for yourself and your own life, and you find that refuge within. Yeah, and of course, taking the Dhamma as a refuge is also kind of interesting, because again, it's like you're taking some external authority again, yeah, in a sense. And of course, I don't mean that we should not take external authorities at all. You go to university, you learn something from a famous or a professor, someone who knows a lot about the field, and of course we do this, but we also understand the limits of these things. And it's the same thing in the spiritual life. In the end, you have to take charge of your own spiritual well-being. Yes, you can have a teacher. Yes, you can take the Buddha as the one who has understood, has some insight into reality. But we shouldn't kind of take it too far. We shouldn't take it to the point where we kind of accept anything in the world, where we do things that are counterintuitive to us, where we go on meditation retreats and people say, oh, sit 10 hours a day, regardless how much pain and if you start feeling crazy, sit more and observe the madness in your mind. And then you go really mad after a while, right? That's the problem. So you take charge, you understand that other people's instructions have only been taken so far, and then you have to take charge of the rest to make sure you don't go crazy in this way. So even then, there is a limit. So in the end, we have to take responsibility. We choose who our teachers are. And when our teachers are dodgy, we chuck them out and we find someone else instead, because otherwise it's going to be problematic. So we follow the advice, even in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, with being islands unto ourselves, with being in charge of ourselves, taking the Dhamma as our refuge. Even that, we do it in a way that is reasonable. And we do it in a way that is, where we take responsibility. And so again, what does it mean to take responsibility for yourself in this way? And the Buddha then says that taking the Dhamma as a refuge means that you try to understand his teachings, right? That's kind of the obvious one, so you can actually use those teachings well. And then he says you use the 4 Satipatthanas as your refuge. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that you start to develop the inner world instead of the external world. You go within. Satipatthana practice is about mindfulness of breathing. It's about discovering the world inside. And it's like building up something which is kind of independent of this world outside, which is so incredibly unreliable and uncertain. We just don't know what's going to happen next. There are 7.5 billion people or something on this planet. We are one of those 7 billion people, and we're not going to be able to change the world. We can maybe make a tiny, minute contribution to the world, but 1 out of 7 billion is not going to be very great. So we accept that, and we realize, actually, if I want to find a refuge, it has to be within. And this is powerful. When you close your eyes and you feel good within yourself, when you close your eyes, the more you let go of the world, the more freedom, the more power, the more independence you feel from that world outside. Actually, it's very powerful. Yeah, it feels great because you know that now you are in charge of your life in a way you have never been before. This is very, very powerful. This is the idea of being self-reliant, having a sarana, having a refuge from the world. And this is then how we can do that and build that up within her. So this is the idea of meditation practice and why this kind of works. And so I want to talk about a few different ways of actually doing this, or how to use the Dhamma in a way whereby we take charge of ourselves. And one of the ways of doing it, I mean, one of the very important things in life is, of course, to live with kindness and live with a sense of compassion for the world. I was mentioning this yesterday, and it is the foundation of everything within the Buddhist practice. All meditation practice is based on this. Everything is based on the idea of being kind and compassionate in the world. So how can we do this? And one way of doing this, of course, is that we have to be mindful of what we do at all times, so we are aware of what we're doing, so we can correct our actions if they kind of get a bit out of tune with the Dhamma or whatever. But mindfulness doesn't happen in a vacuum. Mindfulness itself happens through an understanding that these things are important. Why are we mindful of certain things? Well, the reason we are mindful of certain things is because they are important to us. So I don't know if when you meditate, what happens in your meditation, whether you are peaceful or whether you think about all kinds of things. My guess is that sometimes you're peaceful, but often you think about all kinds of things, right? Is anyone here who has never thought too much in the meditation? Everyone has done that, right? And the reason we do that is because we think those things are important. That's why we do them. And in the same way, in exactly the same way as the things of the world are important to us, and for that reason we think about them, if you want to have success in being kind at all times, the only way you're going to do that is if you understand how important it is, how it really matters. If you understand that this is the crux of the entire spiritual path, that every time you get it wrong, every time you have a thought of anger or irritation to someone, you're actually taking a step backwards. Every time if you get that in a deep way, it is as if you are pre-programmed. You're programming your mindfulness to be aware of this thing, the significance of living well and treating other people around you in a good way. And this programming is what we call right view. That's all it is, right? This is why right view matters so much, because right view is the guidance at the back of your mind which steers you in the right direction. So how can we be more kind in our lives? And one of the tricks that I like, that's not really a trick, it's just kind of obvious really, but one of the one of the ways that we sometimes go wrong when it comes to kindness or it comes to morality is that we have these rules and regulations that we follow. Follow the 5 precepts, or you follow the 10 precepts, or the 227, or the 311, or the 2,564. I just made that up actually, but when you start to read the monastic rules, like the number of rules actually much more than what you kind of think is the Patimokkha rules, right? There's so many rules actually ridiculous in there, and some of them are really archaic, not really make all that much sense. But anyway, there's so many rules, and sometimes we become too rule focused in our lives. We become completely obsessed with keeping these rules, and it's good to keep some of these rules. Okay, you don't kill any living being, so you don't kill any living beings. That's a wonderful thing. That's a good starting point. But remember that the purpose of kindness is not just to follow rules. Kindness has a much deeper purpose, and that is to feel good about yourself. That is really the purpose of kindness. We saw this yesterday on this idea of how meditation works. Meditation works through all of these beautiful qualities of the mind, the pamujja, the piti, the sukha, the passaddhi, and all of these things. And so unless the morality that you live actually makes you feel happy, it doesn't really work. So sometimes we need to ask different kind of questions. We shouldn't just say, okay, I'm going to follow rules. And sometimes you grit your teeth because you don't really want to follow this rule, and you kind of, no. And then it becomes really negative because you follow rules just because you kind of feel forced to follow the rules. But ask yourself how your actions feel to you. When do you feel good about yourself? What are the actions that make you feel good within? Watch that space, as they say. See what's happening within you, and look at what happens when you act with kindness or generosity to someone. See what happens when you do this. When you give something to somebody, see what happens. Do you get a joy out of that action of giving, or do you do it because you're supposed to be a good Buddhist? When you bring it, You go to the monastery and you bring some food to the monastics, for example, and it's one of the most astonishing, beautiful things to be a monastic. And people come with meals, with food every day to you. They bring the food to the monastery. You just have to sit there and wait, and the food just comes rolling in. It's kind of amazing what happens. It's like you can't barely believe it. All I had to do is sit in my cutie, close my eyes, and watch the bread, and people will bring me food for that. I mean, this is the best deal in the world, right? It's a kind of really well-kept secret. But it's beautiful when that happens. And it's it's so uplifting to be a monastic and see all that kindness and generosity. Just wonderful. It's an underappreciated side of monasticism. It's kind of these happinesses and gladnesses there that no one really understands properly. But the point is that the people on the other side should also feel that. When you are giving that food, you're doing something marvelous. We are upholding this thing, this beautiful thing called Buddhism, or the meaning of life, if you want, together in this way by doing this. There's something very powerful going on here. So how do you feel about generosity? Do you just go to the monastery because it's the tradition? Okay, my parents are from Sri Lanka and they gave, so maybe I should follow my parents' ideas or something like that, or whatever, just have to follow this tradition or something like that. But don't do these things in an automatic way. Don't be Buddhist robots. Be human Buddhists, and don't just do things because it's a program that is kind of embedded in you since you were a child. Reflect on these things. How does it work? And then if it doesn't give you joy, ask yourself, why not? How can I make this thing joyful? How can I think about this thing in a way so that it actually does bring me happiness? Notice when you give. And sometimes you may find that actually giving to a beggar on the street makes you more happy than giving to the monks. Okay, so give to that blooming beggar, right? That makes you happy. Don't forget about the monks for a while. Give to that beggar instead. Or if you make more happiness out of giving to the nuns than to the monks, give to the nuns. Watch your feelings, watch your reaction to these things. And when you do that, you learn what actually works in this world. We were just discussing the idea of karma at the Santi Monastery just the other day. And the Venerable Karunika reminded me of this passage in the Kosala Sanyutta, as one of the in the Sanyutta connected discourses of the Buddha. And in this sutta, King Pasenadi of Kosala, one of the great kings of ancient India, the king of the Kosalan kind of country or empire, whatever it was, he goes to the Buddha. He was a very close friend of the Buddha. And then he speaks to the Buddha and he says to the Buddha, he asks, where should I give? It's a very interesting question, right? Where should I give? And you might think the Buddha says, give to me, right? Because giving to the Buddha is a lot of good karma. Of course, the Buddha doesn't say that. It's kind of obvious. It's kind of too blatantly kind of wrong to say such a thing. Or he might say, give to the Sangha, give to the nuns, give to the monks or whatever, but he doesn't say that either. And the answer that he gives, the first thing he says, well, where one should give and where the karma is the highest, where you get most, where the results are the greatest, these are two different questions. So you should not always give where it is the best karma, right? That's what the Buddha says. That is not necessarily where you should give. And that is very interesting because very often Buddhists, they kind of have this spreadsheet, where is the most good karma, so how can I divide my resource in such a way to maximize the karma? And I've seen this happening sometimes, and I travel quite a lot around the world, and sometimes I go to places like, and this is what I heard in Malaysia when I was in Malaysia, and they all said, we are too calculating, we calculate the maximum merit and we kind of give accordingly. That's kind of how we do things over here. And I said, I don't think it's a good idea. It's not really the right way. You need to get your heart involved in these things, right? That's what matters. So feel what you're doing. How do you experience these things? Let that guide you. And so the Buddha says you should give where you feel inspired, where the mind is pacidity. Pacidity means where the mind is inspired, the mind feels confidence, the mind feels faith, and these kind of things. This is where you should be giving. So feel what it feels like, and give random places. Give to anyone, doesn't matter. Give where it feels right. Then you're on the right. Give to the animals. Give to the little ants. Well, I always try in the monastery. Sometimes I eat at my kuti, and when I do eat at my kuti, there's always a little bit left over. Like a little bit of rice grains, not usually that much, but a little bit left over. Then I wash my bowl, and there's this water with rice grains in it. And I try every time when I throw out that water to remember, may this be for the little insects. And that is the difference between making good karma, not making any karma at all, and feeling a sense of joy about it. Okay, maybe just be for the little ants. And the little ants, they're running around. They're so happy when they see a few rice grains, right? They're really, wow, rice grains, check it out. And then they all come along, right? And they so you have to kind of anthropomorphize these things a little bit, to kind of think of these as little human beings, because it's hard to get into the mind of an ant. Maybe fortunately, I don't know. But so this is a very important thing. And do that also, not just with generosity here. Do it with how you speak to people. Do it with how you act towards people. Feel what it feels like when you act to people in certain ways. And when you know that it feels good, that is the way you should act. Ask yourself where you're coming from. Put yourself in the right mental state. Then, when you feel good, that is when you're really making good karma, because the feelings are coming into it. This is something you will be able to use for your meditation later on. Why? Because the happiness is there. You bring it back into your meditation again, and then it becomes one of these sources for meditation to work. So don't be too automatic, is what I'm saying, in your practice of sila. Reflect on these things in the appropriate way, and then you're going to be heading in the right direction. Hope I'm not making you jealous with the coffee. Hope you're okay. So that is one of the things that I wanted to mention, how to take charge of your own well-being. Another way, this was another story I was telling at Santi Monastery the other day. It was very nice, by the way, to be at Santi Monastery, and I kind of really building it up over there. I really, if you haven't visited before, I really recommend you to visit it. It's a wonderful community. They're doing a lot of really excellent work, and so it's marvelous. So please, please check it out. And one of the stories I was telling them was this, and I think some of them haven't heard this story before. I'm always surprised, because all these stories, they kind of go around, especially Ajahn Brahmali stories. You've heard them 100 times, and then you hear it for the 101st time, which is okay, because sometimes it takes 101 times before you get the point of these stories. But anyway, so this is a story that perhaps you haven't heard before. This is a story of from Thailand. Ajahn Brahmali, he had his early years in Thailand, so many of these stories, they come from there. And this was actually a story that was written about, not something that he experienced himself. It was about a very, very famous monk who lived at the end, I think, of the 18th century, 1780s or something like that. And his name was Somdet To. Somdet means that you are very kind of high level in the Thai Sangha, and so you are kind of at the very top. So he was at the very top, but he was also a very famous and very beloved monk. And on one occasion, he was doing like this wedding blessing. Monastics, we don't actually do weddings. We don't wed people. That's considered wrong according to the Buddhist tradition. And we don't do that, but we do blessings. And we kind of give a talk. Maybe we tell the couple to, live in a Buddhist way with each other, try to give some advice so you can actually have a good and worthwhile marriage. And so this Somdet To, he was giving this talk. There were 6 couples. They were all going to get married, right? 6 couples. They met a lot of people. And maybe all the family members and everyone else. And he was then giving them a talk on, how to be kind to each other, and how to live well, and how to live according to Buddhist principles, how to integrate the spiritual practice into your relationships, all of these kind of things. But then the talk got kind of deeper and deeper and deeper, got into kind of renunciation. That's if you're just about to get married, right? And you can hear about renunciation. Wait a minute, maybe this is very interesting. At the end of the talk, everyone was, these couples were so inspired and so uplifted by this talk. They said right, and then, okay, we're not getting married after all. This is it. Okay, we're giving this up. And then apparently a number of them ended up becoming monks and nuns. This is the story of Somdet To, right? And it's kind of it's a really nice story here. And it's a story which shows that very often the reason why we do things in the world is because we don't really fully understand what we're doing here. We're doing things kind of partially here. We're doing things without really having considered properly what is happening here. And one of the great teachings that I received from Ajahn Brahmali in the early days that really made an impact on me. He doesn't mention his teaching very often here, but he mentioned the teaching of the "and then what" teaching here. And then what? And this is this beautiful idea of always asking the question, and then what? Because very often when we think about things in the world, things we want to achieve, relationships, whatever it is, we kind of go, the dream or the idea that we have, we go to the point of achieving the goal, but we don't go beyond that. If you kind of think about your favorite kind of girl or boy to get married to, it goes to the point where you kind of get into the relationship. It doesn't really go, you don't think about what happens afterwards. But Ajahn Ram put it in a very nice way. He said that it's like in the movies. The movies always end with kind of the cowboy and the kind of cowgirl, whatever it is, riding off into the sunset. And everyone is happy ever after. And the fairy tales are always about the prince and the princess getting each other. And then the story always ends at that point. It doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't show what happens afterwards. What happens after you run off into the sunset, right? I mean, what's going on? Well, and of course, what happens then is actually not very interesting. Because what happens then is dishwashing, right? Cleaning up, sorting things out, going to work, making a living, right? It's not the prince and the princess getting each other. Doesn't mean that you live in eternal bliss afterwards. No, there is a real life to be had afterwards. So the and then what reflection actually is very, very useful. And I'm not saying that because I want every one of you to become monastics. Not at all, because sometimes monasticism is right, sometimes it isn't. It depends on all kinds of factors. But this is just a way of reflecting about life in general, to focus on the things that really matter here, the things that are really important. So, and you can use this in so many different ways. And one of the ways of doing it, for example, I think about people who work really, really hard in their life. They identify with their work. They become that person who is kind of a professional or whatever. They are the doctor, they are the teacher, they are the whatever. And they work, and then they come to the end of their working life. And then life feels empty. Life feels like this was me, this was my identity, I was this person. And they come to their life and they can't really deal with being a pensioner or being retired. And because their sense of identity is lost. And that is because we forgot the and then what question at the beginning. What happens at the end of my life? What happens when I actually then eventually have to kind of move away from this thing that I'm doing? And I have identified with it too much. And I don't know how to deal with that situation anymore. And then you live on that memory afterwards. Or it's like sports people. Sometimes you see sports people, the amount of training, the amount of investment that sports people do into their sport is sometimes absolutely crazy. The kind of hours, the obsession with these sports. If you want to become an athlete of kind of, really significant athlete, the amount of effort you have to put into it is absolutely mind-boggling. And the vast majority of people, of course, they put in all that effort and don't even get there, but still. And you hear about these people who win like medals at the Olympics or the World Championships or whatever, and they put all these medals into a cabinet, right? And they kind of look at those medals, and then when they have finished as athletes, they kind of go back and they look at those medals in the cabinet, and they live on that memory for the rest of their life. And it's as if they're living in the past. They're no longer able to deal with the present because their identity is so tied up with winning those medals and all that hard work. They forgot to ask the and then what question. I do all of these things, but what actually happens at the end of my life? Shouldn't there be something more? Isn't there something more to life than just winning these medals and doing these kind of amazing feats of an Olympic athlete? And of course there is. And when we forget that, that is when we get problems. We forget that life is this much larger thing. There's much more to life than doing one thing, because you always have to move on. There's always something more at the end of the day. The same thing is true for relationships. There always comes a point when you have to part. And then what? What happens when the other person dies? What happens when the other person leaves you? That is where the and then what thing comes into the question. The war in Ukraine, I think, is another kind of good example. You see all of the Ukrainians and you can see why they go into the war. We're going to defend the mother country and we're going to work really hard. And it feels very kind of meaningful, when you are at war with some external aggressor who is torturing you, and you go into that willingly. But at the end of the war, having had all that sense of meaning, then the war will be over one day. Then what? Suddenly all that time you spent in the war defending your country, maybe even killing people, it feels like crazy. It feels like madness. It was so meaningful at the time, and afterwards, in retrospect, actually, it was just a dream. It was just this thing that passes, and then it's gone again. And so much of life is like that. We focus too much on the things of the moment, forgetting the larger picture and not remembering actually something more here. And the more, what is that? Well, that's the spiritual path. Because the spiritual path is always something that is always valid, regardless of whether you are you can be an athlete, but be an athlete in a good way. You can maybe even go to war, but go to war in a good way. Look after the people who are injured or whatever, right? Something like that. And then that is where you find that meaning. That is where, when the and then what kicks in, you understand, I must remember the bigger picture here. The bigger picture is to create that refuge within, the refuge of the spiritual path, something that is independent of all these external things, the larger picture, the larger understanding of the world. And so this is why I love Ajahn Brahmali so much, and why he has kind of been so important in my life, because he has taught me all these kind of life skills. And he has forgotten about his and then what teaching already. I don't think he remembers that one, but I remember it because it made a really big impact on me when I heard it. Because there's always comes a point when you think, okay, yeah, actually, I'm a bit fed up with monastic life right now. Yeah, I've had enough, and I'm not really inspired at the moment. Ajahn Brahmali is acting a bit funny. Yeah. Maybe a girlfriend, would that be a good idea? maybe that is kind of an alternative. And of course, that happens. I've been a monk for almost 30 years now, and it's very. Of course, these thoughts, even if they are kind of semi-idle thoughts, they do arise sometimes. That's just the way it is. And then you think, and then what? Actually, I don't want to do the dishwashing. I don't really want to go back to work again, so no, forget about that. So we kind of come back to reality again. The idea of working for money, for me now, seems really, I shouldn't say this in a company like this, but actually it doesn't seem very attractive to me at all, to be honest. Anyway, that is another way of learning how to look after yourself, thinking in the right way, thinking about life in a broader kind of scope. So these are the two ways then. One is to remember, how do your actions affect you? Make sure that it actually does have the effect that we're supposed to have. We're supposed to become more happy. Second thing, have the larger philosophical view of life. Stand back a little bit. Don't allow yourself to be trapped in all the everyday things. And one more thing, because we have still a bit more time. So I'll talk about one more thing. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. And this also leads a lot to thinking about life in a kind of broader picture, broader way here. And that is the idea of contemplating death. Yeah? Are you into contemplating death? Yeah? Okay, cool. I'm really glad to see that. That's excellent. Because some people think, contemplating death, let me get out of here as soon as possible. So this is your chance. If you want to escape, you have the opportunity. But I really recommend death contemplation. And the Buddha specifically says in the sutta that everyone should be doing death contemplation. Women, men. One of the kind of strange things in the sutta is it has ittiva purisova. It always has the woman first. I think sometimes that's kind of fascinating, because very often Buddhism, like most religions, is a little bit gender imbalanced. Yeah, that's kind of the truth of it. But sometimes there are little things that kind of bring the balance back a little bit. And it's good to notice those, right? So here, the women always come first, which is kind of cool. And I was discussing this with Bhikkhu Bodhi, because I was working with Bhikkhu Bodhi on some of his translations, and he had changed it to man or woman. And I told him, well, actually, it doesn't say that. It says woman or man. So shouldn't we keep that sequence? So that's what kind of my... And he said, no, but in English, we always kind of have man and woman, right? And so I told him, well, here is an exception to the rule. Surely we should keep that, because if there is an imbalance there already, if there's something that can redress that a little bit, why shouldn't we do that? And so we did change his mind. And this is one of the things I really respect about people like Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. He gets a young whippersnapper like me. I'm not that young anymore, but I was young then when I did that. And he listens to you. And he takes your comments seriously, which is kind of, again, which is really nice when, you get scholars who have that kind of openness of the mind. Anyway, so women and men, monastics and lay people. I think actually it says lay people first and then monastics afterwards, which is kind of interesting as well. And everyone should be doing death contemplation. There is a sutta in the Anguttara 5s, I think it is, the 5 kind of contemplations everyone should do. I'm subject to death. I haven't gone beyond death. I'm subject to old age. I haven't gone beyond. I'm subject to sickness. everything that is dear and beloved to me must become otherwise, and I'm the owner of my karma. Only thing you own in the world is your karma. Everything else is transient. Remember that. It's an important point. Everything else you don't actually own. The only thing you own is your karma. That is what you're going to have to take with you. Anyway, so death contemplation. So this is maybe one of the most powerful of these contemplations, because the Buddha talks about it in so many different places. And one of the places where he talks about the idea of dying is when he first sets out on the spiritual path. When the Buddha starts to think about becoming a monastic and leave the lay life behind, one of the most important things that drives the Buddha to do this is the idea of death. You see, when you read the suttas and you see the Buddha is contemplating and he's kind of thinking about life, and he thinks about death is actually one of the main things that drives this person. It's not the Buddha yet, it's Buddha to be, drives him to become a monastic. We often talk about the four Devadutas, Devadutas, divine messengers, you can call it, translate it into English. And one of those divine messengers is the idea of dying. And that's maybe the most powerful one of them. And the Buddha obviously, he obviously thought about this. And this is kind of really interesting, because what that means is that the idea of dying is in many ways the source of Buddhism. That's why the Buddha became the Buddha, because he thought about dying. This is kind of the driving thing behind the Buddha in many ways. So we should thank the contemplation of death. That is why we have Buddhism today, because some person some long time ago thought about death in the right way. That's why we have Buddhism. And that's kind of extraordinary. So how did that happen? And the way that this happened, the Buddha talks about this in one of these autobiographical suttas called the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, the Noble Search. And in this Noble Search, he thinks that, here I am subject myself to old age, illness and death. And then what do? I go out into the world and I look for other things that are also subject to old age, death and all of these kind of things. And what are those things? Well, wife, children, and of course all the things that you own in the world. And in those days, the things that you own are all animals, for example, like, cattle and horses and these kind of things. The wealth of people was often decided by how many cows you had. If you had lots of cows, you were very wealthy. That's kind of how it was counted in ancient India. So someone very wealthy had lots of cows and horses and other animals and all these kind of things. And of course also gold and money and all of these things. But then the Buddha reflects and this is kind of where the Buddha is special. This is what makes the Buddha different from the rest of people. And when he sees that actually I am subject to death myself. And then I go out into the world looking for all these other things that are also subject to death. Here, death is used slightly metaphorically here. In other words, they're subject to disappearance. They're subject to things I'm eventually going to have to give them up. You cannot hold on to these things. Certainly not living beings. They're definitely going to die. But even things that are non-living, eventually they're going to have to go. They're subject to death in a kind of broader sense of the word. And then what does the Buddha do? He decides to become a monk on that basis. And that is kind of what makes the Buddha a Buddha. He sees something simple, something ordinary, but he sees it in such a profound way that it drives him to actually search for something more profound, something beyond death. And this is so it's a very profound contemplation. That's what it means. This is so profound that it actually takes you ultimately all the way to the end of the spiritual path. And this is what is so fascinating about the person like that, is that that thought, that idea is sufficient to make you leave the whole world. And in those days, they didn't have Buddhism, right? They didn't have Dhamma. The Buddha had to figure it all out himself. So he, thought the very kind of audacious, I'm just going to go off into the forest and find the answer to death. And it's kind of awesome when you think about that. How can anyone do that? Just go off into the forest and find the answer to the problem of death? It's kind of it's extraordinary here. And this is kind of what makes the distinction between a Buddha and the rest of us, that a Buddha actually has this audacity and this ability to go really, really deeply into things in this way. But it means that for every one of us, we should make more out of that contemplation. We too can reap a lot of benefits from a simple contemplation of things that are so obvious, so obviously part of life, the idea of dying. And then the Buddha goes forth and he practices really hard. And of course, he does find that solution to the idea of death. He finds, well, not the idea, the reality of death, I should say. And he finds the awakening experience based on that very idea. So remind yourself that sometimes that you're going to die. And every time you remember that you're going to die, it will change your priorities. You'll think about life, you think about the world in a different way, because suddenly other things become important. If I know that I might die tomorrow, am I going to disrobe so that I can kind of have a relationship or something like that? Doesn't make any sense, right? If I'm going to die tomorrow, it's kind of crazy to kind of disrobe. And the Buddha specifically says, if you remember death properly, you will never disrobe. You will stay as a monastic. And the same thing in lay life. If you remember that you can die, and it is very uncertain when you're going to die. Very often it always happens when you don't expect it, pretty much. Then you will change your priorities. Should I tell this person off, or should I just let it go? Is it sensible to get angry in this situation, or is it not sensible? If you are lying on your deathbed, and we are all lying on our deathbeds, can you feel that? You're lying on your deathbed? We're all lying on our deathbed already, right? We're just waiting for this to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen. You're already on your deathbed. That is kind of the whole point of this. But if you are lying on your deathbed, are you going to pick an argument with somebody? It's the last thing you want, right? You're waiting to die, for goodness sake. You want to let go of this world. You're not going to pick an argument with anyone. If someone wants to argue, say, "Oh, just please go away. I don't." This is not the time to talk about the war in Ukraine or whatever, who is right and who is wrong, or climate change or whatever. I just want to be in peace. I want to kind of relax, and you want to have a mind that is at ease. You want to have a mind that feels good. You're dying. You're out of here. There's nothing in this world that matters to you anymore. All of these things could become irrelevant. And this is the power of the idea of death. The idea that you remember what is important. Your priorities get turned the right way around. So every morning, when you get up, every morning when you're about to leave your house, about to go to work, or whatever it is that you do, whatever it is that you do in your life, I'm not sure what that is. Coming here is one of them, which is great. Remember, today you could die. Many years ago, I was in Brisbane, and I was this Sri Lankan man. I was visiting a monastery in Brisbane, and this man of Sri Lankan background came to me. He was a psychologist or psychiatrist, or one of those. And he said to me, and this was kind of really nice, he said to me, every day when I go to work, I remind myself, today could be my last day. And I thought that was really cool. He was a layperson who really taking this idea of death very seriously. And then he said that when I do that, I remind myself that I have to leave my wife and my kids in a good way. I can't leave them after an argument. What if I never see them again? I don't get a chance to say sorry. I don't get a chance. I didn't really mean that, but in the heat of the moment, I said things I shouldn't have said. And this is the problem. It's always possible that it's the last time we see each other. We can never really afford to say something bad to someone else. Rather, we should always forgive if someone else does something wrong. That is always the right attitude. You can never afford to say anything wrong or do anything wrong. Every action matters. What if these are the last words I tell you right now? It's possible. We just don't know. Hopefully not. But hope doesn't really get you anywhere, because things just happen anyway. So what if these are the last words I talk to you? I want to say something nice, something useful, something inspiring, maybe even something where I make you feel good about yourself. I don't want to tell you off the last thing I do, sitting up here on this seat. And the idea of death brings you back to the reality, what really matters, what is important, how we treat each other, building up the good qualities. And when you combine that with these other things I was talking about before, the idea of feeling your morality, feeling your kindness as you live your life well, the idea of having this big overview of life, remembering what really matters, and then what? Then you have some very powerful ideas about how to live your life in a good way. Now, all you have to do is to do these things. That is kind of the final thing, and I'm going to maybe talk more about that later when we come towards the end of this retreat. How to actually enable you not to forget these things. And that is the most difficult thing of all on the spiritual path, is not to forget what we're supposed to be doing here. It's bleeding obvious when you hear it and given in the talk. It's absolutely clear when you think about it rationally, when your mind is at peace and you are in a good space. But then you go back to work. Then you go back to your ordinary relationships. Then you have to deal with all the things in the world. Everything goes out of the window. How can we avoid things going out of the window? How can we remember these things all the time? This is in many ways, I think, the most important thing on the spiritual path, because only then is it really possible to make progress and to keep on the path and keep kind of going as we in the right direction. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for an hour almost already. So marvelous. So now let's do some more meditation together. I think the program next says something about walking meditation. Are you into walking meditation? It's not raining outside, so we should take the opportunity before it starts. Yes, I think this is a chance to do walking meditation. So let me just give you some ideas about how you can do walking meditation, in case you don't know. Is everyone here an expert in walking meditation already? Yeah? No? Okay. It's good to ask whether people are experts already. But so this is some ideas about walking meditation. One of the things about walking meditation is that it can be done very informally. It doesn't have to be very kind of formal or very focused or anything like that. And I often like, when I do walking meditation, often I just walk back and forth and just kind of enjoy walking back and forth, not doing anything else, and just watching my mind and kind of feeling the peace around me, that kind of thing. That is often very nice to do, because when we sit in meditation, very often we do things like watching the breath, or we focus on a particular topic. And sometimes that can make the mind, sometimes it works really, really well. And when it works well, it's wonderful. But sometimes it doesn't maybe work 100%. Maybe you feel a little bit tight or a little bit tense, or maybe your body is hurting a little bit anyway. And sometimes it's nice to do something else rather than just focusing on things all the time. So sometimes when you walk back and forth, just enjoy the peace. Try to focus on what a wonderful place this is, that we have this opportunity to be here together with your Kalyanamitas, the good friends, and just get a sense of inspiration and walk back and forth. And then when you do that in the right way, you gain a sense of peace just through that, just by walking back and forth in that way. And then when you come down in afterwards, in half an hour or whatever, you're actually ready for your sitting meditation as a consequence. So this is one way of doing walking meditation. I think for many people that's actually the best way, because it just feels nice. But if you want to, you can also do all kinds of other things in walking meditation. You can do all of these kind of contemplations that we do. Contemplation, I mean, you can contemplate death while you're doing walking meditation. You can think the next step, I might be dead. Scary. Maybe stop moving because you're afraid the next step you're going to die. So you kind of just freeze, right? Okay, otherwise you might die. But so you can do death contemplation in various ways. You can think it's the next step, or you can think it is, just tomorrow or next year or whatever. But just a reminder, and to kind of solidify this idea of dying here, because the idea of dying is often, it doesn't come easy to us. And it takes time for that really to penetrate the mind properly and to become a powerful thing. So the more you kind of ruminate on that or reflect on that in the right way, the more natural it becomes. And you start to see that there is truth to this. You really could die on your next step. Actually, it is not wrong. One day it is going to be your next step. And because it is going to be that one day, well, you might as well be ready now. That's kind of the idea. And this is actually how the Buddha talks about in the suttas. Next breath, you should be ready to die in the next breath. I'm afraid of breathing now. Okay. So this is how you can do it. Or one of the very classical ways of doing walking meditation, if you want to do more samatha practice and calm yourself down, it is to actually focus on your feet as you walk. So you have a walking path or walking distance of maybe 20 meters or so. And then you have a starting point and you have an end point. And as you walk those 20 meters, you just follow the feelings in your feet as your feet are touching the ground. And you can become very, very focused through doing that. So if you want to do that, that is a fully acceptable, fair income way of practicing. Notice my Aussie fair income way of doing things. I'm Australian citizen, as I got to get into the Aussie lingo. And so you do that, and you walk up to the end, and you turn around, and you feel the feet going back again, yeah? And you just focus on the feet. And it's just like the breath, the more focused you become, the more you see of the movement of your feet, right? The more you experience that movement. And when you hear about someone like Ajahn Brahmali, he loves walking meditation, and he did this again back in Thailand in the early days. He would do walking meditation in the meditation hall they had there. And this meditation hall, they had a concrete floor, and it was the worst concrete floor in living memory because it was done by the local villages. The local villages were rice farmers. They didn't know anything about laying concrete, so they can pour the concrete out and kind of smeared it out a bit, and then that was the concrete floor. That was kind of how they were doing things. And so the concrete floor was like this. Yeah, it was really rough, and you had to sit in meditation there. So it was the worst concrete floor. But Ajahn Brahmali said that was the most beautiful concrete that he'd ever seen in his life. And the reason was because his meditation was so deep, right? So this beautiful concrete, and full of colors and light and all of these kind of things. And that is kind of the bane of the monks at Ordinariness monastery, because it means that Ajahn Brahmali wants concrete everywhere. Because to him, it is the most beautiful thing in the world. So whenever we say we're going to make a new road, Ajahn said, yeah, concrete. He said, no, enough concrete. He just want a dirt track, yeah, with a bit of grass in the middle. No more concrete. No concrete. We have to have concrete. So Ordinariness monastery has the most concrete roads, I think, in any monastery in the world. We should go into the Guinness Book of Records or something, yeah. So and that is kind of, it shows you how malleable perception is, right? So see if you can see the beauty of concrete. At least you can see the beauty of the lawn outside if you walk on the lawn, yeah? And you walk back and forth, and you keep that focus if you wish. So that is some of the ideas of walking meditation. You can do almost any other contemplation as well, like metta or whatever. So entirely up to you what you want to do. So let's try it out, yeah? And please sit if you prefer to sit, do whatever you like, really. And we can come back and do some more meditation. I'll come back here probably in half an hour or so. We can do some more meditation here afterwards. Okay.